There are two things you need to know about me for this video. One, I'm an arts kid. I do theater, I dance, I write. I have been known to binge TV shows on occasion. Two, I just read Plato's Republic for class this semester, and I have to write an essay about it now. Anyone who's familiar with Plato's philosophy, and if you're not, don't worry, might be able to predict that after I sat down and really thought about it, I wanted to write a fiery roast of Book 10 of Plato's Republic, in which Plato decides that imitative art, which encompasses most of the visual, auditory, and plot-based media we consume these days, is ethically bad, and that he needs to exile it from his ideal city, or polis. I was all ready to write that essay too, where I'd heroically save art by crushing Plato's arguments. I'd even dug up some sections of Aristotle's Poetics that argue for the usefulness of art so that I could have help flaming Plato from one of his own students. And then I had a Zoom call with my professor about my essay, and I told him my rough idea, and he said, "Well, okay, that works." And I looked at him, thought about it, and I said, "You probably get this exact essay a lot, don't you?" And I could tell from the look in his eyes that he had. And then I remembered the principle of charity, the idea that the best way to argue against a thesis is to actually build up that thesis to its strongest form. It helps you understand what your opponent is actually saying rather than what you want them to be saying, and it makes any defeat you manage of their thesis far more satisfying and convincing. If you defeat the best version of an argument, then that argument is pretty much a goner. So I went out and I found a paper by philosopher Jessica Moss that gives a charitable reading of Book 10 and does it well. It changed the way that I think about this section of Plato's Republic, and it changed the way that I argue against it. Ultimately, I don't want to see art kicked out of Plato's polis or any polis. But the fact that now I actually understand why Plato felt like he needed to is a game changer. So today, I'll first be summarizing Plato's worries about art in Book 10 of his Republic, particularly his worry about imitation. I'll then summarize Moss's more nuanced and charitable reading. I'll then offer an argument against the more charitable rendering of Plato's worries by asserting that art isn't only imitative, but has, depth to it. Next, I'll examine a counter-argument, and then I'll conclude that my assertion can still stand and maybe even help get art back into the polis. And, in a delightful act of irony, I'll be doodling artistic renderings of why art is good or bad the whole time. I'm biased towards imitative art, okay? That's why I'm writing this essay. First off, here's the background info. Plato lived and taught during the 4th century BCE in Athens, Greece. He was a pretty high-status citizen and was a student of Socrates, a teacher to Aristotle, and founder of the Academy. Overall, a pretty groovy guy in ancient Greece. In his Republic, he tries to define what justice is by constructing an ideal polis, or city, a project that spirals out from an initial inquiry into what justice is and results in him questioning how one ought to order society and teach children and what is good and bad for people on the whole. It's at this point where his discussion of art comes into the picture, and it all comes to a head in Book 10. Plato is mad at art for two main reasons. First, he thinks it's imitative, which is bad, and he also thinks it's too pleasurable and evocative of emotion, which is also bad. In this essay, I'm going to focus mostly on Plato's worry about imitation, which is more metaphysical in nature, or relates to the central abstract theories that Plato has formed, and takes up more of Book 10 on the whole. Plato's main worry about the imitative aspect of art is how far removed it is from the ultimate truth of things, which he calls forms. By imitative, he means any kind of art that tries to mimic something that isn't actually there, from actors in a movie to the doodles of cats you keep in the corners of your notebook. Plato starts off with a discussion of a painter, a carpenter, and the form of bed. The form of bed is the beddiest bed that we can imagine. It's the ideal bed. Literally, it's an idea. It doesn't exactly exist in the material world, but it's a great bed. All carpenters make their beds based off the form of bed, which represents a degree of removal from the form itself. But painters, they don't portray the form itself, but the carpenter's bed, which must then be an imitation of an imitation and therefore thrice removed from the form. And this is a meaningful shift. Plato points out that you can't see the bed from different perspectives, you can't sleep in it, it just kind of looks like a bed looks. But maybe it can, quote, deceive children and foolish people. And this deceptive quality is a concern because artists can produce everything in their paintings or poetry, which means that they can act as if they know anything. And producing all these things in their art can indeed convince some people that the artist knows about all sorts of things, when in reality, they're mostly acting as illusionists. If a poet writes about what doctors say to their patients, for example, she doesn't really know anything about practicing medicine, not the way that, say, a doctor does. In reality, the poet has, quote, no grasp of the truth, and her art is, at its core, like the faces of young boys who are neither fine nor beautiful. While on the face of it, the argument makes sense, it's not uncommon to finish Book 10 and find some of Plato's arguments a little lacking. He seems to say that people will, in some cases, be readily deceived by a painting of a bed and think it to be a real, actual, physical bed, or that a poet portraying a doctor is a big, enormous liar because they do not themselves practice medicine. While I was initially prepared to take these objections and run with them in an essay, I instead found an essay by NYU professor Jessica Moss called What is Imitative Poetry and Why is it Bad? Through Moss's more cohesive reading of Book 10 of the Republic, I've been able to put together a clearer picture of myself of what Plato's arguments are actually getting at. Moss, in this paper, emphasizes the particular danger of the relation between appearances and the shiny ideal forms, as Plato has laid them both out. She takes the bed versus painter face-off as a low-level example of the kind of disconnect that Plato sees in something like poetry, and I take Plato's discussion of poetry to include many kinds of plot-based imitative media like prose or theater. She compares the alleged danger of an ignorant person mistaking a painting of a bed to be demonstrating some knowledge of beds to the way a similar painter might portray a car. Moss points out that one can, with no knowledge of how a car works or what makes for a genuinely good car, know just what would make a car look fast or tough to ignorant children. These children would likely not understand or care if the artist chose to draw a detailed schematic of a car with a particularly powerful engine, but they would understand if the artist drew a sleek silhouette with orange flames on the side. Moss thinks that poetry captures the same kind of imitation of appearances, but with human action and character. With no real understanding of what makes a virtuous person, the poet tries to craft a character who appears virtuous to the masses. The issue here that Moss points out is that the characters who appear virtuous in dramas are actually people that Plato would consider to be notably vicious or full of vice. Plato believes that truly virtuous people are moderate, calm, and mostly engage in philosophical discussion. The issue here is that the kind of people who are virtuous under this model are maybe the worst candidates for the main character of an epic poem or drama. As Moss says, imagine an Iliad cast only with Nestors, or a sane, dispassionate Hamlet with no taste for revenge. Or imagine a protagonist who accepts imminent death calmly and spends his last hours engaged in quiet, rational persuasion. Poets gravitate instead towards characters who indeed appear virtuous to us. Think superheroes, spunky princesses, rats who cook. I'm just listing off Disney Pixar movies. But Plato would describe these heroes, depending on the translation, as something like irritable and multicolored. People who are swayed by their passions and are impulsive, rather than led primarily by things like quiet rationality. It is the excess of passion that makes for a compelling hero, and the excess of passion that worries Plato. He considers letting oneself be led by passion rather than rationality to be quite a notable vice. With this line of reasoning, Moss gets us to admit that, through Plato's view, that it is only ethically harmful poetry, poetry that reflects and reinforces the flaws in popular morality, that can compel us and move us with its portrayal of human affairs. The stakes here are not only that some imaginary character has more vice than the audience might realize, but that these vices may actually transfer over to us as viewers. Plato believes, and I believe this too to some extent, that we often grow up modeling ourselves after the heroes we see in media. If we are modeling ourselves not after virtuous people, but after vice-filled dramatic characters who we mistake as virtuous heroes, then it is understandable why we must consider removing art from the ideal virtuous city. But at some points, Plato states that he would like to keep art in his polis if possible. As Plato says, if the poetry that aims at pleasure and imitation has any argument to bring forward that proves it ought to have a place in a well-governed city, we, at least, would be glad to admit it. I believe that such an argument exists, and is clarified by Moss's more nuanced reading of Book 10. Because of her analysis, we understand precisely why we must be so concerned with the way that art interacts with imitation and appearances, as well as why art seems to necessarily fall into imitation and appearances based on the demands of its audience. If we are to accept Plato's form-based metaphysics and his definition of virtue, then I think that with Moss's defense of his arguments, it's fairly fruitless to argue that dramatic heroes are going to be as virtuous as Plato wants, due to the demands of plot and intrigue. Instead, I believe the best course of action is to argue that poetry does not exist entirely within the realm of imitation and appearance, that it instead pursues deeper truths just as philosophy does. This is true to my experience. I've read science fiction stories that read like philosophical thought experiments. And I think that many of us have encountered pieces of artistic media that have made us sit back or wander around and contemplate humanity or the nature of our existence for perhaps longer than was comfortable for us. Oedipus Rex, for example, is quite a famous play that would have existed during Plato's time, and one that tries to dig a little bit deeper than simply portraying some spooky prophecy and a man literally sobbing his eyes out on stage. The play grapples with what fate is and what family is, and the play tries to work through one's duty to one's house, one's state, and the gods themselves. This is a lot deeper than mere appearances. It even sounds like an interrogation into the nature of Plato's forms, but simply through a different medium. Moreover, I believe this interrogation through art is effective. Not only does Oedipus Rex come to compelling decisions about the various metaphysical and ethical inquiries it brings up, but plenty of other pieces of artistic media, from novels to opera to fan fiction, find the same success. Ask any literary theorist about theme and symbolism and similarly nuanced dramatic elements, and they will certainly be able to name a plethora of pieces of media that use these elements to articulate complex and meaningful theories on what is or what ought to be. Moss might be skeptical about this course of argument, however. She might worry about how much knowledge the artist can truly have about what they purport to represent. Plato shows artists have little relevant knowledge of what they portray. They don't know cars the way that mechanics or professional drivers do, yet they imitate them so as to convince others that they know more about cars than they do in reality. If we can't trust artists with something as comparatively simple as a car, how can we trust them to know and portray something deeper about the forms of things, like happiness or justice? How can we be sure that these deeper questions and theses aren't exactly like the rest of their work? Imitation of appearances rather than deeper understanding. I worry that to object to art on these terms would be dangerously close to implicating philosophy as well. Plato criticizes artists for portraying things, like beds, and pretending to know something about them, when they are not bed-making carpenters who have received knowledge from serving countless users of beds. Plato also criticizes poets for portraying figures like doctors, when they themselves have never practiced medicine beyond, perhaps, some above-average Band-Aid technique. Moss sustains this line of objections in her work as well. However, is this not markedly similar to a great portion of the theoretical work that Plato attempts in his Republic? He's not just trying to paint a bed. He's attempting to construct an entire polis where he theorizes about the ideal pursuits of everyone from cobblers and farmers to soldiers and kings. If we don't trust a poet to represent a doctor because of their lack of medicinal knowledge, since they can only be truly good at one thing in Plato's framework, and that is poetry, then why should we trust Plato's theories about the nature and duty of cobblers, since he doesn't have any knowledge about shoemaking? Plato himself is also still not entirely free from the realm of imitation in his work. Many people have pointed out that the Republic is written completely in fictional dialogues, where Plato imitates Socrates speaking to various other characters for the duration of the work, none of whom are him. If Moss or Plato were to truly object to my line of argument because they feel artists could not possibly have knowledge of the forms when they lack knowledge in so many areas, then Moss or Plato must be prepared to concede that philosophers might necessarily lack knowledge of the forms because of their similar lack of knowledge in the same areas. Since I assume that this is an unacceptable concession for them, they'd both be out of a job at least, I take it that my arguments about art often containing within it a meaningful interrogation of deep truths and forms in a way similar to philosophy must remain a contender for allowing art back into Plato's polis. In the end, I'm glad I moved away from my first instinct to squash Plato, intellectually, of course, by showing that his arguments were bad and embarrassing after an initial reading. Instead, pursuing a reading by Professor Moss has helped me think more about the media I've been consuming lately and ultimately give a more refined and interesting counterargument to Plato's philosophy than I would have otherwise. And when I think about it, isn't it such an impulsive, multicolored, and passionate move to waltz in assuming you can dismantle Plato with a few swipes? Sitting down and thoughtfully considering Plato's aesthetics, that's far less dramatic, but dare I say it, a little more virtuous, too. Thanks for watching.